And good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar on next generation data protection. Today's presenters are Larry Stein from Novacoast and Josh Jordan from Forcepoint. For over 20 years, Larry has been providing leadership in DLP, vulnerability and endpoint security, often specializing in rapid deployment process and products. Larry continues to advance the efficiency and control of vital IT technology today. Josh Jordan is a consulting sales engineer with Forcepoint and brings over 20 years experience in the cybersecurity industry. Josh joined Forcepoint having spent time on the front lines, developing data protection and insider threat programs and strategies at both Target following their breach in 2013 and Boeing Corporation. For any questions that come up today during the webinar, please utilize the chat function to ask any question. Questions can be sent to all panelists or directly to myself, Brian LaJoy, here throughout the session. Questions will be answered and addressed at the end of the presentation today. With that, we will turn things over to Josh and Larry to get today's webinar started. Take it away, gentlemen.
All right. Good afternoon. Good morning. I want to first take a moment to thank everyone for their time and being here for the webinar. I think what we're going to do here is kind of talk about this next generation data protection kind of theory, if you will, or value proposition back to organizations and kind of jump right into this. I want to take a step back and highlight a little bit of some of Forcepoint's kind of take on data protection as a whole, specifically our point of view here. At a high level, we really kind of break down data protection into three buckets. The first being visibility. And as we kind of walk through this and have the deep understanding of DLP in its traditional sense and its necessity, it really provides that powerful visibility to most organizations. The center bucket would be analysis or analytics. That's what we're going to kind of talk about today as we're talking about this next generation concept. And then last but not least, this action bucket, right? The concept there of visibility, analysis, and action really formulates the why, right? At the end of the day, providing value back to an organization comes back to detecting things at the earliest point of detection, but also protecting the lifeblood of the organization, which is its people and its business, right? And how do we do that? With providing access or increasing access to users in our environment while still protecting the organization. So kind of thinking about that should kind of, prep this thing moving forward. But before we jump too far into it, right, thinking about just where we are currently, current impact across most organizations today are, protecting data wherever it resides. You can see on the right-hand side of the screen here, right, there's obvious numerous challenges here. DLP as a whole provides, a lot of foundational concepts. You got data governance, but really kind of providing a return on investment back to your organization seems to be first and foremost, right? It's a tool to supplement a program and grow across an organization. When we think about that, some of the low-hanging fruit are to go after things like compliance and regulatory, policies. If you are mature enough in the organization that there's a relationship with, some of your cross-functional partners like human resources, you potentially have the opportunity to have a policy in place to look at folks that have resigned from the organization or are, potentially leaving, maybe reduction in force, et cetera. But that's not necessarily true across the entire space. Foundationally, we came up with this concept of dynamic data protection, and that is this next generation offering. What it's doing and what it's designed to do is two really key components. The first is to build on an existing infrastructure and development and program that has been developed already in your organizations, and to leverage the existing policies, et cetera, that have been developed. The second is to take some automation steps to really kind of provide some long-standing needs, I would say, in the industry as a whole, and that kind of resides at the level 1 remediator and response level, in kind of the event fatigue, smaller operating teams, folks that aren't operating in a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week kind of space. And so that specifically has been designed to kind of give that look into the future, build on the investment in place, and give you more return on value. So what do I mean by risk adaptive protection? If you take a look, I think it was 2 years ago, Gartner had said, hey, the way that folks should be thinking about data protection is a risk adaptive approach to security management. But much like anything else, what does that mean? As I kind of touched on that in the previous slide here, really kind of doing what's beyond our traditional tool sets, kind of pushing those to the limits and getting more out of your investment is that conceptual offering, right? So how are we doing this? On the Forcepoint side of the house, we're really taking like those DLP policies that are created, and instead of kind of going out and searching for data and understanding we have to protect data where it resides, what we're doing is we're saying like, that's already in place there, but when we develop a policy and we protect data and we just apply it to a mass of people, anywhere from 3 to potentially hundreds of folks, depending on the organization and who has accesses to that data, we're treating everybody the same, right? And there's really no kind of outcomes derived from that. So if I were to move a piece of data today and it's a policy violation, it gets followed up to in a response process that maps back to the formal kind of process in an organization, and it's treated as a one-off event. But what if there's other underlying characteristics that somebody is bringing from a risky standpoint to the table that make them kind of different from the other population of folks in that policy? We're taking that kind of traditional concept and flipping it on its head. So we're leaving in place that policy, but we're saying, look, we're going to focus on the risks that folks bring to the table and how they interact with the data, and we're going to treat them appropriately so at the endpoint by saying, look, open filter at that lower risk level, right? Business as normal, doing your job. But if there are other characteristics that they're bringing to the table, that risk level is going to increase, but we might be able to restrict some of the capabilities for that person at the end of the day. As you can see here, the risk levels drive different outcomes. Foundationally, this doesn't change significantly. I think it provides a more menu of options, and I'm going to touch on that here in a few moments here. But I want to touch on one additional component here, which is this unified policy concept. So when you're looking at these traditional tool sets across the board, enforcement becomes some of those challenges that we're dealing in on a frequent basis. Being able to replicate that same policy across different tools within the organization and mirror those traditional kind of responses that you want to closely match, data protection outside of, kind of the network and endpoint level pose some challenges. We have this unified policy concept where we can take those traditional policies in DLP, leave them in the DLP console, but push them to the cloud and have enforcement actions here. What does that do? It obviously kind of streamlines and simplifies the ease of use with a single, interface to deal in, but it also maps into this risk adaptive concept, the branching out and pulling in of, other egress vectors that, are kind of moving with and adapting to the needs of security in a modern organization. So the big challenges. When we go out and we have this concept or dynamic data protection in a production environment, our customers are bringing real life challenges to the table. A few that we've experienced in the past were, locking down USB access for an entire enterprise. Obviously, that poses significant challenges to the security force that's dealing in data protection, the data protection team itself. The concept of having the dynamic data protection in place has afforded those individuals the opportunity to look at risk in a different perspective, not from a blocking piece, but to understand really the interaction or the relationship between people and data, right? Mapping back to that point of view. And really focusing on then the business unit level, right? I think about when, we went and we would do things, in a former life, right, as a pilot. I need to go out and I need to, address this egress vector and see how I may be able to, put some restrictions in place to eliminate some pure noise and pure volume, right? Pretty traditional approach would be, let's run a 6-month pilot, let's take 10% of a business unit, and let's just see what file types people are moving, right? Very, very labor intense, and at the end, we're dealing in very small percentages. This risk adaptive concept looks at not only the individual users, but then maps them back to folks that are also in the same job category or business unit, as well as geolocation. So I can start with something like 100% USB, access across my entire organization, but then go through and look at different portions of the business and say, purely for example here, right? The human resources folks don't need USB access. So by eliminating that, I have a factual, percentage of decrease across the organization, and providing return on investment back to, the folks that are investing in this data protection program year over year. Moving away from the reactive kind of state of data protection or DLP as a whole as well, and kind of moving towards that predictive element, or proactive element, I think is an additional benefit here as well. The uniqueness is that as DLP programs foundationally mature, there's a middle space of going from reactive to proactive that often is the most necessary, but is often the most overlooked. And it's based on kind of being stuck in the operational masses of event fatigue and trying to, see if and validate if things are a true incident, and then go through that whole process. And it's the time consuming piece behind it. And at the end of the day, we're missing on that transition where DLP becomes offered as a service for an organization, where we're able to really reach out and understand the business units themselves, the data, the people, the classification, and really mature that component there. So I think of this in a time savings perspective, as well as kind of getting to the point of focusing on risk by kind of policy violation fatigue, if you will, and really start to grow a program from maturity and educate folks along the way at the same time. All right, so the moment most people have been waiting for, right? What does this look like in practice, right? So when we look at a traditional policy, foundationally, regardless of what DLP system you're using, we're posed with a couple options: monitor, block, web prompt, audit and confirm, depending on what product you're using, right? With this risk adaptive concept or offering, what we're doing is we're giving you an additional kind of menu of choices here. The uniqueness here is that when we look at like risk level 1 through 3, life is good, business as usual. The benefit, though, is at that remediator level, where they're not sitting here having to go through and dismiss, something that would be a lower severity level event, right? That also then puts into play this concept of focusing more on the riskier behavior and truly getting to the point of, DLP is great at identifying the who, what, when, where, but it hasn't ever really addressed the why, right? This kind of 4 and 5 in this example allows you to focus more on that and really understand and tie into place why somebody's interacting with that data, what they're moving it for, or what they're using it for. So conceptually, it's pretty unique. So you can see here, the uniqueness of this as well is that you still can deploy this in audit-only mode. The cool part about that is you can start to build those relationships of how folks are interacting with your data. We have some customers who have not implemented blocking with this, but they are getting a deeper foundation of how policy changes make effect across organizations. So when they start to, add some additional security maturity to the organization and talk about concepts of moving towards, blocking or appropriate use, et cetera, they can start to see how that relationship is kind of flourishing in the system. You can still kind of go through and look at the alerts themselves to identify the data exfiltration, but this is essentially what we're solving for, right? DLP as its whole has always given you the foundation for, data exfiltration, but it's really been a manual process and discovery of actually mapping those events together into a story mode to be able to go after them and look for them. And then you can now leverage analytics to not only identify, but also block risky users. And what we're seeing is twofold here. That block in our production environments for our existing customers, we're seeing anywhere from about a 2 to 5% of the entire enterprise population actually being blocked, depending on size, obviously, and policy structure, et cetera. But the focus is shifted to really identifying the needs for organizations and really being adaptive to security measures. As you know, security organizations are there to supplement, revenue generation for a business and kind of get away from that, security of no, right? We can't do this, we can't allow that action, et cetera. And then also eliminating things like having to put into place exception policies, right? And then going to that exception management struggle that we have oftentimes. I'll tell you this, having reported directly to CISOs for, the past decade or so prior to coming to Forcepoint, a lot of my conversations surrounded risk acceptance, right? Hey, we have these programs in place, we have these tools to supplement the programs, but understand that when this piece of data leaves our organization, it's essentially gone and we're never going to get it back, right? This concept of risk adaptive protection does two things. It shifts that conversation to a risk mitigation strategy by also pulling into the fact that it's automated in the background at the endpoint level, right? So the uniqueness there, if you think about it, is if I don't have a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week DLP team, I'm only as good as the 8 hours that were in front of the computer. The next day I come into the office, I find out about the previous 16 hours of activity that took place. Having a risk adaptive approach in place with dynamic data protection here provides that cutoff at certain points to essentially address the needs of the organization and protecting the organization and the people as well. Building off of that, this is kind of a foundation for risk adaptive monitoring, risk adaptive, approach, et cetera, to this space. But it builds off of kind of Forcepoint's portfolio as a whole, if you will. Thinking about data protection, I think it's near and dear to most every, organization that's out there, and it's foundational. But then there's also additional, use cases, scenarios, et cetera, that flourish from there. So I just want to kind of touch on this just ever so slightly here. But think about the concept of like a malicious user and a risk adaptive approach, right? Somebody's working while they're on vacation, enters a restricted area. We have a logon, file copy, and bulk copies. So in a traditional sense, working in a Fusion Center, SOC, whatever, I may be going and interacting with my team. I may find out about that individual in the morning brief and then have to follow up with a few team members, go into my boardroom, and then have a talk about this, pull in investigators and really understand this. But when you start to look at this risk adaptive approach and how we can apply some filters in place, when that user is working on vacation and we see all these same events taking place, again, that risk is going to be dependent on what they bring to the table. So in this case, if they're working on vacation, most folks do in this day and age, unless you have a policy, a corporate policy in place that says you won't work on vacation, where we have no action taken, enters a restricted area that could be business as usual, logs in, right? They're exploring systems. This might start to look a little bit different. Copy the file. Again, we're not necessarily terribly stressed on this, but then the user starts to exfiltrate data. When we apply this risk level methodology to this, we could have somebody coming in and having some unusual aspects take place to where we're building out at the top here, where their risk is so risky to the organization that we're going to take that action blocked and we're going to lock down that account, maybe have them re-authenticate, apply some additional kind of structure in there. Again, this is a little far beyond the next generation DLP realm, but this is the kind of path that we are pushing towards, internally at Forcepoint with our product offerings at the end of the day. I believe that there is a questionnaire that's going to be popped up here momentarily. I want to turn that over really quickly. You guys should be seeing a poll right now. please take the poll.
We'll have the poll open for another 25, 30 seconds or so. And there are the results from the quick poll. Thank you, everybody, for submitting your responses. Some interesting numbers here in statistics. And with this, we will transition and turn things over to Larry Stein.
Hi. So where Novacoast comes into play here is to assist organizations in planning their security roadmap, providing experienced engineering talent to design and implement DLP, and provide operations management and system tuning. Our goal is to help you mature your system and its effectiveness. So here's a sample maturity roadmap we used for a very large implementation in the healthcare field. This encompassed a much longer time frame than most customers, but this timeline was how they were able to fit into their overall data security program goals. They actually ended up in that green space on the far right about a year and a half earlier than they planned. The big thing was jumping from what Josh mentioned, where if you look at what they had planned for 2016 to 2017, they didn't get stuck in that area of having the system tuned and running how they wanted, and transitioning into automated responses and listening the day-to-day tasks of their administrators. The timeframes on these plans vary around many things, but typically size and geography of an organization are the primary factors. They all boil down to initial planning, implementation of the first pieces, enhancing the features they're using and tuning, and then at that final stage, introducing automation. Our first step, and really the most important one to a successful data protection program, is to ensure that the organization is prepared for a successful implementation. This involves recommendations on corporate sponsorship. It's very important to have buy-in at the top levels of the organization and have that flow down. DLP is an intrusive program. People are going to see changes. They're going to see alerts. If you go to blocking, they're going to see that. We want to make sure that that's being enforced from the top down. We also help with defining corporate policy. Now, not the policies that DLP is using to protect data, but the corporate policy on what data is classified, how that data is allowed to be used, and who's allowed to use it. And then a very important thing is employee education. It has to be very clear to people what they're allowed to do, what they're not allowed to do. And DLP shouldn't be the ones educating the employees to do it, but it should be reminding them of what they're already supposed to know. Once DLP is initially implemented, there's really 4 phases an organization goes through. And first is a visibility phase. And during that, we're getting visibility into the organization's data, how it's being used. It's during this time we also find what we call broken business practices. As an example, an employee sends a file to a payroll processor weekly that's not encrypted. They're not doing something malicious. It's just a business process that they've been doing that needs to be modified. Typically, when we find these things and bring it up, the first response is, well, we've always done it that way. So again, it's not someone doing something malicious. It's just doing what they've always done without thinking about the data security behind it. During that phase, we also expect to find where sensitive data is stored, and we want to determine who owns that data. For example, if there's a employee database with sensitive information, we want to document that the owner of that data is human resources, for example. During the remediation phase, these broken processes that have been discovered or fixed, policies are tuned, and staff education begins in earnest. In the next phase, notification, we don't block anything yet, but we do start notifying users that something they're doing is violating a security policy. This is done through something like a pop-up in Windows, an email notification, something like that. Some organizations will break this into two phases, starting with just a notification and then changing that to not only a notification, but you have to hit an extra button and confirm it, or enter a justification and then confirm it. Actually, making the staff take one extra step to start enforcing their thinking about data security. Now, this is when you really start seeing a decrease in the number of incidents you'll be seeing in the system. Then in the last phase of implementation, we would actually start blocking. So the common pitfalls we see in a DLP implementation, and this is something Novacoast has done countless times, doing these implementations, or coming in on ones that, more typically coming in on ones that haven't gone as well as an organization wanted. And the first one is treating DLP like an install instead of a project and a system. And this also goes back to what I talked about earlier about having corporate buy-in and having that buy-in from the highest levels. This isn't something that should be implemented solely by IT. An IT administrator should not be the one building corporate policies. The IT administrator's role in DLP is taking those company policies I talked about earlier and translating them into a language that DLP understands and able to enforce it. Another thing we see a lot is inadequate resources for event handling and running the system in general. If your employees are already, they're already doing 50 hours of work in their 40-hour work week and not taking into account the resources for implementing an additional system and something that's generating these events, you really have to take that into account for personnel and resources. And the last thing is inadequate policy lifecycle definition. And really what this means is having a formal procedure for approval of a policy, building that policy, testing, and then following back around with it to make sure that it's working how you want and that your policies are up to date. So why Novacoast? Well, Novacoast has a team of engineers that are solely focused on DLP with a combined experience measured in decades. Novacoast managed services philosophy is based on a co-managed build, operate, transfer model. This model is when an organization hires a service provider to implement, optimize, and run a business process, with the end goal being that the service will be matured to the point that the hiring organization will be able to easily assume responsibility for the running of that system. This is something we've done many times when we first started with doing managed DLP. Our goal was still to increase the maturity of the company's system. And then what started happening is these systems got tuned, started running very smoothly. We had organizations say, you know what, we're going to take this system back in-house. By doing this in a co-managed way, and what co-management means is that the customer organization owns the system, they own the resources, they own the data. This means during that transfer phase, whether it's scheduled or whether for some reason you want to part ways with your managed service provider, basically that means there's no issues during that transfer phase around contracts, around hardware, software, ownership, or access to that data. So the 4 phases of our managed service philosophy are, first is engagement planning. We want to verify and document program requirements and goals, have something to measure against, and we want to provide advisory services to create a realistic program maturity roadmap for each organization. Then we go into the build, and there we design and implement the DLP system, providing tons of industry experience to ensure optimal resource allocations. We implement initial policies, start run books for event handling, just get the basics of the system up and running. The next phase is we go into the operation and optimization. And there, we manage the operations of the system, including its health, expansion, inclusion of new features, integration into other systems. Additionally, we provide security analyst function to add, modify, and fine-tune policies, as well as do that first-level response to DLP events. Then the last phase is transfer. And when the organization is ready to take operational control of the system, it's up to date, it's running in an optimal fashion, and there's a defined roadmap to enhance the system and the security program's maturity. Josh?
Yeah, picking up here, delivering business outcomes, right? So, Forcepoint, and why Forcepoint, I guess, at the end of the day. So for us, in kind of, where we've kind of walked through this journey together, I'd say we have a lot of deep investments in, being purpose built. And I think that might be a phrase that's kind of overused in the security industry as a whole. But, coming to light with things such as this dynamic data protection offering, right? It's a opportunity for us to, integrate into our portfolio an analytics offering that does more than just become some behavioral analytics engine, right? It's core and foundation. It's core in looking at what we can do, how we can push things and make them more user friendly, and ultimately benefit organizations across multiple industries. Really heavily focused on like the slide states, right? Analytics driven visibility, maximizing that core foundation of DLP, looking at and applying those risk adaptive controls in place to, ultimately assist to discover new things, to push beyond the limits and become a little more proactive in our approach, and then have that intelligent and dynamic automation. I had the pleasure of listening to our CEO this morning, and he calls this smart DLP at the end of the day, right? As a foundational, tool in everyone's toolkit, vital necessity to the organization, but definitely needs more focus in what it can do and push it to a greater offering. So some of the takeaways here: increasing employee productivity, driving that growth, focusing on real problems, vice the policy violations that we touched on before, and then kind of moving that needle, shifting from reactive to proactive, and supplementing that work that Novacoast offers and Larry has discussed here previously. With that, I'll turn it back over to Brian.
Great. So we have a handful of questions coming in for both Larry and Josh here. Again, feel free to add a question via the chat function, and we will address here. Our first question, I believe this one is for you, Josh. Most of our end users share devices, so blocking by IP is not functional and cannot know what user it was. Are you able to address this?
So I would say the answer would be yes, but it's also a partial yes. When we sit down and we address the needs of an organization, obviously the data component is one of those. The users is the other. Leveraging DLP at its core, we would end up putting people into buckets based on policies, et cetera. But we are leveraging like an Active Directory or a Workday or some other ability to map those people to the core of an email address, user ID, a logon, things of that nature that are core to the human element of this puzzle.
All right, thank you. Another question here. We work in a heavily regulated industry, and protecting PII is extremely important. How are policies managed or implemented in the risk-based approach, no matter what the user risk level is?
Great question. So building off of the core of DLP in those instances where the data is paramount from not leaving an organization, right? And you really want to lock things down. You still, in this risk adaptive approach, have the ability to block all of that data, regardless of risk level, from leaving the organization.
Right. Another one here. What happens to the end user experience if they've exhibited risky behavior, but then start to move down the risk chain?
It's a great question, and I think it's two parts. So the first would be, the restrictions would kind of be in place. So if we had somebody that was trending towards, potentially dropping email attachments from an email, or having the web prompt challenging them, kind of for, is this for business purposes, kind of that instant user education on the fly, like web prompting. That would be in place, but as the risks started to decrease, those would ultimately be removed automatically as they started working their way back down. The second piece of that, though, too, is still providing the remediation team the manual ability to adjust those risk levels as appropriate, to where you have, somebody that you can reach out to, maybe as a part of an action plan, and say, hey, just want to follow up on this behavior here. Maybe it's some user education, and now that's been documented, or a system has been in place to where they can manually adjust that level back down to a 1, 2, or 3 from, say, a 4 or 5. So there's two options there.
Great, thanks, Josh. There's 3 more questions, it looks like here. Can you use Forcepoint while still in a semantic environment?
That's a great question. Currently, the answer would be no to that. Our foundation for dynamic data protection in the risk adaptive model piece only is core to Forcepoint DLP. However, our Forcepoint behavioral analytics platform does solve for data exfiltration in McAfee, Symantec, and other vendor-specific DLP environments as well. However, it doesn't have it'll have the proactive piece, but it does not have the automated enforcement at the endpoint component yet. I'll say yet.
All right. Can data protection policies be extended into cloud applications?
Yes, and that's regardless of vendor in that particular sense there. So being able to manage those out of what we call our Forcepoint security management system, we have the ability to push those policies directly to those corresponding investments that you've made across the enterprise into things like a cloud access security broker.
Great, and that looks like one more question as of right now. For organizations that have implemented this risk-based approach, are they seeing a reduction in resource hours managing the data protection program?
Yes, great question. So the answer is yes. From our production environments and even in some proofs of concept that we've run, we're seeing anywhere from, and it depends on size, the amount of policies, et cetera, obviously, to preface this, but anywhere from about a 60 to 80% efficiency in being able to eliminate a lot of the noise and focus more heavily on, the true response element and the risk component here at the end of the day.
Great, thank you again, Josh. Looks like that is all of the questions for today. So want to thank everybody for taking time out of their schedule to join today's webinar. Special thank you as well to our panelists, both Larry and Josh Jordan. Today's session was being recorded, so if you joined late and there are any portion of the webinar that you missed, we will be distributing a link following the webinar to review the recording at your leisure here. So again, thank you everyone for joining and taking the time with us today. Have a great rest of your day here.